Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. I'm going to tell a semi-philosophical talk, but it's going to have some formulas and results and math and things like that. I urge you not. I cannot really speak without saying the exact details. But I will recommend not getting too bogged down in the exact formulations and things like that, just to get some idea what this is about. So where does the story start? And I'm going to, for this audience, I'm going to assume that you guys are familiar with our favorite objects. So we have integer partitions, which we visualize as Young diagrams. And then we fill them with numbers from 1 up to n that are strictly increasing along rows and down columns. We create the standard Young tableau. And these are completely self-contained combinatorial objects that people study. But for me, they have another significance. So this, of course, the number of standard Young tableau is famously counted by the Hooke length formula. I'm not going to go into the details of what it says, but it's an exact product formula. So that's the best thing that one can get in terms of an answer in algebraic combinatorics, right? So where does this come from? It originates in the representation theory. So if we study the representations of the symmetric group, which is finite, and the representations are indexed by exactly these partitions of n, and they're called Specht modules. So here is an example. I don't know if, can you see the cursor from, or no? Probably.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So these are our guys. In this particular case, so if we take the vector space C3 generated by the three vectors C1, E2, and E3, we can, the symmetric group is acting by permuting coordinates, and these are the two invariant subspaces that are, in this case, the Specht modules. So it turns out that the basis, a basis for the Specht modules can be indexed exactly by the standard Young tableau. So create the Young symmetrizer. If you read Bruce Sagan's book, it's very nicely explained. So the dimension is f lambda, which is the number of standard Young tableau, and has this beautiful formula that I just showed. Okay, so far so good. Then we can study the way we study representations usually is by their characters. So for the symmetric group, there are the characters which are always integers, positive or negative in this case. So they're the traces of the corresponding matrices. And the counterpart of the story is the general linear group. There, the irreducible modules are the Weil modules. They're also indexed by partitions, but they're called highest weights because they're not a partition of a fixed number, but they can be arbitrary size, except that the number of non-zero parts is bounded by this n. And what are the characters of these modules? Just to bring everything in under the same roof. So these are our favorite Schur functions. And they have many different formulas, but in combinatorics, the favorite one is as the generating function for semi-standard Young tableau. So these are the ways we can fill this Young diagram with integers weakly increasing along rows and strictly increasing down columns, and recording what integers we filled out in terms of these monomials. And so we can do a lot of this algebraic combinatorics and representation theory just on the language of this combinatorial objects that we just showed. Okay, so this is so far nicely understood. So let's, and by the way, please interrupt me if there are any questions. So for now, I'm reviewing background, but if something is not clear, please let me know. So what can we do with representations once we've understood them somewhat? We can take tensor products. So we can take tensor product of two irreducible GL representations. It is still a representation, then we can decompose it as a direct sum of other irreducible representations, and they are going to appear with certain multiplicities, which are just by definition non-negative integers. In the case of the general linear group, these coefficients are the Littlewood-Richardson coefficients. So they serve as motivational problem in a lot of algebraic combinatorics. So there is there are special cases of the Schubert structure constants also in algebraic geometry, and so they appear everywhere somehow. And what's nice about these Littlewood-Richardson coefficients? Well, there is no product formula like I showed for the dimension, but so they can be studied with symmetric functions, with characters. So this is their structure constants for the ring of Schur functions. They have a rule, right? So what is a combinatorial rule? In this case, Littlewood-Richardson. It's telling you that these Littlewood-Richardson numbers are equal to the number of some type of tableau. The Littlewood-Richardson tableau, I think we probably all know what the rule says, but the point is that this is counting some discrete combinatorial objects, and for each of these objects, we can actually write it down and figure out that it is one of our objects easily. So I'll define what I mean by easily, but for now, we just stick to the philosophy. So that is a combinatorial rule or a combinatorial interpretation that everybody likes and somehow wants to mimic it somehow in various ways. But of course, I mean, even that Littlewood-Richardson rule, first of all, as you can see, it took quite some time to prove it. And to prove it rigorously and correctly. And also, if you want to get the values of these Littlewood-Richardson coefficients just from this rule, it's not gonna be so easy. So it's not like the product form. So what's the other thing we can do? So this was for GLN. We can take the symmetry group, take two irreducible Specht modules, decompose them into irreducible representations of Sn, so it's acting diagonally on this tensor product, and then we have some other multiplicities. These G lambda mu nu. These are the Kronecker coefficients. Again, non-negative integers just by definition. And if you want to do Schur functions or characters, you can compute them this way. So there are a lot of, for practical terms, a lot of the times we use this when we want to work with them, but a lot of the fact that they are non-negative integers is not clear from this picture, for example, at all. It's clear from the definitions from representation theory. And there is another class of constants that people like to study that come from the composition of general linear group representations, because they're just maps from basically one GL n to another GL m. So you can compose two of them and then decompose it as a representation. You're gonna have some multiplicities. These are called the Pletism coefficients. And you can study them as substitutions in Schur functions also, and expanding it in Schur functions. So that's, in some sense, for practical purposes, pretty convenient, but from conceptual purposes, this is not giving you any nice formula so far. So what was the So Murnaghan defined the Kronecker coefficients in 1938. Actually, the Little-Richardson coefficients were defined before that. And what he noticed is that for some special cases of partitions, the ones that have long first rows and the second parts add up, so you have this equation, then the Kronecker coefficient is actually equal to the Little-Richardson. So immediately that means that the Kronecker coefficients actually generalize the Littlewood-Richardson, despite what may seem otherwise, because the symmetric group is a subgroup of GLN. And then, so he initially asked in his paper how to compute them. So he had a lot of problems just finding the values for special cases. And then this was picked up later by Lascaux and Garcia-Remmel, and then Stanley in his famous seminal paper where he listed open problems in algebraic combinatorics, he listed this as problem 10 to find a combinatorial interpretation, something like the Littlewood-Richardson rule for this Kronecker coefficients. And there hasn't been much progress on that, unfortunately. So there are still only very special cases. The most general one is when one partition is a hook and the other are arbitrary, but it still measures 0 from all cases that we want to know. And likewise, for the Plethism coefficients, it was listed as problem 9. Find the positive combinatorial interpretation for the Plethism coefficients, and there may be even less such cases for those known. And by the way, just to test you, what is problem 11 in the list? So that one, the problem 11 is for the Schubert structure constants. So another thing that I'm sure people here like to work on. Okay, so none of these are answered at this point. And so there is a particular reason to study Kronecker and Plethism coefficients other than the just pure aesthetics and combinatorial curiosity. They actually play a role in this geometric complexity theory, which is in computational complexity, the program to distinguish algebraic complexity classes, their VP versus VNP in particular. And so if we had actually ways to compute more precisely or understand these coefficients more precisely, we may be able to say something about computational complexity this way. But I'm not going to talk about this today. So the question for today is, what is really a combinatorial interpretation? So when we are asking this question, so for Kronecker or Plethism or Schubert structure constants, how do we know that we found the combinatorial interpretation, and can we even say that such thing would not exist? Actually, the more important question in the case that many people are spending so much time working on this. And this is where computational complexity comes in. So what is the idea? So first, there are some basic computational complexity classes that I will try to remind you. So if we're looking at decision problems, we have input, which is encoded as a bit string, zeros and ones, maybe, or just ones. Just how many ones is just an integer. And then we want to do something to that input and get an answer that is yes or no. So is our input nice or not? For example, if our input is an integer, we may want to know whether it's prime or not. And there is a parameter involved here, which is the size of the input. So we need to keep track of. That's how we're going to measure complexity. It's going to be a function of this n. So there is the class P that you probably heard of. So this is when the answer can be achieved in polynomial in n time. In particular, actually, it was a big breakthrough. Deciding whether an integer is prime can be done in polynomial time. But what else can we do? We can solve linear algebra problems easily in polynomial time, figuring out if a graph is connected, all these other things. So the counterpart to this is the class NP. So NP has a funny definition, but basically it's telling you that if the answer is yes, I can prove it to you in polynomial time. Basically, like if the answer is yes, then that's what's called a polynomial time witness. But I think the easiest way to see it is on an example. So the NP complete problems, one of them is to find a Hamiltonian cycle. So if you just have the graph and you try to find if it has a Hamiltonian cycle, you're probably, whatever you do at this point, you're going to do exponentially many long search, exponential time. But if the graph has a Hamiltonian cycle, I can give you a sequence of vertices and you can check just in linear time, actually, if this is actually a Hamiltonian cycle, if these vertices are connected by edges. So this is a witness. So something that if the answer is yes, then there is an object that's nice and that can be understood. Of course, we don't know whether P is equal to NP, but we are going to assume for the purpose of our studies that it's not, because otherwise the world is not so interesting. And just to give you an impression of what this thing looks like, computational complexity, there are so many other classes and we don't know separation between most of them. So this is a small picture of the complexity zoo. But let's assume it for a moment. So how do we, okay, so then there are the counting problems, which are same thing, except now you want to have the number of things. So there is the class FP, where it's telling you that you can compute the exact number of objects in L or whatever, graphs with, or let's say if you're given a graph, maybe you want to compute the number of Hamiltonian cycles, or you're given a matrix, you want to compute its determinant, all sorts of things. So FP is when the answer can be obtained in polynomial time, and Sharpie is the counting analog of NP, and it's telling you that whatever you are counting can be expressed as an exponentially large sum. So you have a lot of freedom here. So exponentially large sum of things that are 0 and 1 and can be decided in polynomial time. So this is like an indicator function telling me if my object is nice and should be counted. So counting Hamiltonian cycles in graph is okay, because you can just go over all permutations of vertices and check for each one of them if it is a Hamiltonian cycle, and that belongs to the class Sharpie. So it's a really large class. And of course, some things that are in here are not so nice, but we are going to argue in an opposite direction in a moment. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's go back to our combinatorial problem. So we want to understand what's a combinatorial interpretation, and we have our problems. So some of them have nice formulas like the Hooke length formula, determinants, and so on. And from computational complexity point of view, these all are in, so the decision problem is in P and the counting problem is in FP. So when you have something like the Littlewood-Richardson rule, so what's called the positive combinatorial interpretation, that is immediately in Sharpie, because for each of this Littlewood-Richardson tableau, you can check in polynomial time if it is a Littlewood-Richardson tableau. So all you need to do is check the ballot sequence. Okay, so then if we have the computational complexity idea, so how can we say that a problem would not have a combinatorial interpretation? Well, if the problem is not in sharp P, of course, assuming all these distinctions in the complexity classes, then this is pretty bad. And then you cannot really hope for a nice combinatorial interpretation. So whatever you do, it's gonna be pretty horrible. That's the idea. Of course, if the problem is in sharp P, it doesn't mean that the interpretation you get is nice and you like it, but so that's a human part of the whole program. But if it's not in sharp P, then it's really bad. So where do we stand with our favorite objects? So I'm gonna skip this pretty quickly. Number of standard Young tableau can be done polynomial time. You have a formula. Number of semi-standard Young tableau, what's Q shape if you want. So there is no product formula, but there is a determinantal formula, and it's also polynomial, so it's pretty nice. Then we go to the Littlewood-Richardson coefficients. So here is our combinatorial rule that we are counting this tableau. So we can formulate the problems in terms of computational complexity. We have the input, our partitions, input as strings of integers. The integers can be inputs in binary or in unary, which is going to change our input size. But let's not worry about that for a moment. And if it's in unary, it's easy to decide if it's positive. And computing it is in sharp P, but it's also if the input is in binary, you can say that because Littlewood-Richardson is non-zero if and only if there exists a certain polytope is non-empty. And this follows from Knudsen-Tau's theorem. This is not always the case. In this case, the decision problem is actually in P, not just in NP. And we know that computing them is sharp P complete if the input is in binary. We actually don't know where exactly that stands if the input is in unary. So when the input is in unary, you have more, N is actually larger. The input size is larger compared to your actual input. And in that case, you have more freedom to polynomial time actually takes you farther away. So we don't know exactly where the Littlewood-Richardson stands when the input is in unary. So there is already an open problem here. But in any case, the combinatorial interpretation definitely puts it in sharp P. So the other side, we have Kronecker coefficients. And first, Mulmuley conjectured, so that Mulmuley was doing geometric complexity theory, that they are in P. Turned out they are NP hard, but we don't even know whether they are in NP. Then he conjectured that they are in sharp P. So that means that, so if they had a combinatorial interpretation, that would be the case. And there is the counterpart conjecture from Igor that they claim that he thinks that they're not in sharp P. And the same thing can be asked for the Platism coefficient, so which we can formulate in this way. So these are all open problems. Basically, we want to use sharp P to understand whether these are whether there exists a combinatorial interpretation, and in particular, if we show that it's not in sharp P, then it doesn't have one. And here is, so I don't really have much time left, but I just will show you one problem which is not in sharp P, a combinatorial problem. So such animals do exist, and it's possible to do this. So characters, as I mentioned, They can be computed by Murnaghan-Nakayama rule. What's the problem here? You have a lot of pluses, a lot of minuses, and we don't know how to cancel them, right? And it's a huge, huge sum of positive and negative things. So this is a way to compute things, but it's not giving you the sign or anything else directly. And of course, they are useful for computing multiplicities. Here is the character table of S4. The first column is the F lambda, the number of standard Young tableau, and we know the sum of the squares is equal to n factorial. How else do we know this identity? We know it as RSK. So pairs of tableau give you permutations. What if we take another column? You can write a similar formula. Sum of the character square is equal to some product formula. Does this have any combinatorial meaning? So to begin with, we need to ask whether this thing has a combinatorial interpretation. And we can phrase this in terms of computational complexity. Where does computing these characters stay within computational complexity classes? And what we proved is that computing them is not actually in Sharp-P unless the polynomial hierarchy collapses to the second level, or this is some statement equivalent similar to P equals NP in computational complexity, which nobody believes should have. And in that sense, we don't have a combinatorial interpretation for the characters. So I can stop here. But if you want, I can show you how the proof works, and I have 2 more slides.
Well, we can stop here and see if there's any questions, and then maybe one of them is about the proof. So first off, thanks very much, Greta, for a nice talk. So let's thank our speaker. Are there any questions to kick us off?
I have a question. Thanks for the really nice talk, Greta. So it seems like after characters of Sn, maybe Kronecker coefficients are the next. I mean, yeah. It's not close necessarily, but so Kronecker coefficients are like tensor products for the symmetric group. Is there an example of a family of groups, not necessarily the symmetric group, but finite groups, you know, going off to infinity, where you can prove that the tensor product problem for representations is not in Sharp-P? I mean, that's a vague question, but maybe, you know, by switching the group, you can prove something more easily.
I don't know of any such result, and I must say, so we are working on the Kronecker coefficient right now, so I can't. It's still not entirely clear which way it's going to go, but for other groups, so proving computational complexity results is also hard, right? So you need to have some formulas to deal with it, something to be able to reduce to, and I wouldn't know for general groups, I wouldn't know how to approach it at all and to be able to prove that. But that's an excellent question, so one should look into it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I actually had sort of 2 questions. The first one was, you focused on sort of the representation theory aspect of like using Stanley's questions from 2000 as motivation. There's also the whole, you know, F vector story to that particular article. I was curious if you looked at computational complexity of any sort of F vector problems as well.
That's another good question. So actually, Igor Pak and Sui-Hong Chan have a result along these lines. It's related to Stanley's inequality. I mean, it's for partially ordered sets, but it has to do with polytopes. So sure. That's the closest one that I know of.
Okay,
and otherwise, yeah, probably a lot of these questions that have not been answered in a long time may actually be candidates for not in Sharpie.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. Hi, Greta. What about something like just the column sums, or knowing when the character value is 0?
So just the column sums is another open problem right now. I think it was either row, so I keep getting confused, but one of the row sums or the column sums was known, and the other one is an open problem, and it's actually part of this Stanley 2000 study, and we don't know where it is. So we would like to actually say it's not in Sharpie. And as far as character being 0, this is actually what's on the next slide. This is how we show that there is no combinatorial interpretation, because it turns out that deciding that whether the character is 0 is a very, it's what's called C equals P complete problem, which is a very large class, which goes beyond, extends beyond what would be in Sharpie, and that's what causes the collapse. So characters being 0 is, I would say, a powerful problem which contains many others. You can think of it that way. So characters are actually very, so they take all sorts of values, and you can play around with them to represent whatever function you want, it turns out. So that's, in that sense, that's why they're so complicated.